50 years after it first hit theaters, people are still arguing about Blazing Saddles. It's the kind of movie that shouldn't have worked, a raucous, filthy, fearless comedy that mocked racism, mocked Hollywood, and mocked the entire mythology of the American West, all at the same time. Audiences either loved it or walked out offended, sometimes both in the same screening. But buried inside all that chaos is something almost nobody talks about, a genuine, honest-to-goodness continuity error that sat on screen for 5 decades before anyone bothered to point it out. Not a scandal, not a scene the studio fought to cut, just a small, human mistake hiding in plain sight inside one of the most meticulously insane productions in comedy history. To understand how something like that could slip through, you first have to understand just how much chaos this film was built on. By the early 1970s, Mel Brooks had already proven he could make audiences laugh at things they weren't supposed to laugh at. His earlier film about a Broadway producer staging a musical glorifying Adolf Hitler had shown that the sharpest way to defang something monstrous was to make it ridiculous. So when Brooks turned his attention to the American Western, a genre built almost entirely on myth, nostalgia, and quiet racial erasure, he didn't want to gently poke fun at it. He wanted to tear the whole thing down and dance on the wreckage. The story he built was simple on its surface. A corrupt land baron wants to seize a small frontier town, so he convinces the governor to install a black sheriff, assuming the townsfolk will be so outraged they'll pack up and leave. Instead, the new sheriff turns out to be smarter, calmer, and more capable than every single person trying to run him out. What starts as a cruel political prank collapses into an uprising against bigotry itself. Brooks didn't write it alone. He assembled a small writer's room that included Richard Pryor, arguably the most dangerous and brilliant comedic voice working in America at the time. Pryor understood exactly how far a joke about race could travel before it stopped being satire and started being cruelty, and he pushed Brooks to walk right up to that line over and over again. The film that resulted didn't just include a racial slur used against its hero. It weaponized that word against the people who used it, turning every bigot in the film into a fool undone by his own ignorance. It's easy to forget now, watching the film as a beloved classic, how radioactive that approach was in 1974. This was a country still reeling from Vietnam, still watching Watergate unravel on live television, still working through the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. Hollywood westerns, for the most part, hadn't caught up. They still cast white heroes against faceless threats and rarely gave anyone else a real voice. Brooks wanted to detonate that formula from the inside, and he needed a cast and crew willing to follow him into the blast radius. The plan, originally, was for Richard Pryor himself to play Sheriff Bart. He had helped invent the character, understood his rhythms, and could have brought an entirely different, rawer energy to the role. But the studio's insurers refused to back him, citing his well-documented struggles at the time, and without that insurance, he legally couldn't be hired to carry a major studio picture. It was a decision made in a boardroom, not on a set, and it reshaped the entire film before a single frame was shot. The role went instead to Cleavon Little, a classically trained Broadway performer with almost no film experience. Where Pryor might have played Bart with visible fire, Little played him with icy composure, a man so far ahead of everyone around him that he barely needs to raise his voice. That contrast turned out to be exactly what the satire needed. Little's calm, faintly amused delivery made every racist townsperson look even more foolish by comparison, because Bart never seemed rattled by any of it. Casting the Waco Kid, Bart's washed-up gunslinger sidekick, turned into its own crisis. The role first went to Gig Young, an Academy Award-winning actor whose entire career had been built on gravity and restraint, seemingly perfect for a character introduced hanging upside down in a jail cell, sleeping off a bender. But on the first day of filming, Young's own struggles with alcohol became impossible to ignore. He was visibly unwell on set, and production had to shut down almost immediately. Desperate, Brooks called Gene Wilder, his collaborator from the producers. Wilder said yes almost on the spot, flew out, and was in front of the camera within days. What could have been a disaster became one of the most quietly beloved double acts in comedy history. Wilder's spaced-out, world-weary delivery playing perfectly against Little's dry precision. Neither actor had been the studio's first choice. Both ended up defining the film. Even the film's smaller casting decisions carried strange stories. A former professional football player, cast largely for his size, ended up delivering one of the movie's most quoted lines with a deadpan so perfect that it became a piece of internet culture decades later, long after most people had forgotten where the line came from. None of this was planned with any precision. It was improvised, patched together, and somehow it held. What made all of this survivable? The insurance problems, the on-set collapse, the sheer recklessness of the material, was one clause in Mel Brooks's contract: final cut approval. Warner Brothers could object all they wanted, but they could not legally force him to remove a single scene without his consent. And they objected constantly. When executives first watched the finished film in a private screening room, the reaction was reportedly stone silence. No laughter, no applause, just visible discomfort. Studio leadership treated the film less like a comedy and more like a liability, and there were serious internal discussions about releasing it quietly in a handful of cities, letting it die without promotion, and moving on. It was a common strategy at the time for a film the studio didn't believe in and couldn't legally bury outright. Brooks refused to let that happen quietly. He believed, stubbornly, that the film's sheer audacity was its selling point, not its liability. He was proven right almost instantly. When Blazing Saddles opened in early 1974, theaters in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago saw lines stretching around the block. Warner Brothers, caught flat-footed by a film they'd been prepared to write off, scrambled to expand the release. By the end of its run, the movie that studio executives had wanted to hide had become one of the biggest comedy hits of the decade. Even actors who turned the film down understood, in hindsight, what they were passing on. One legendary Western star was reportedly offered a cameo and declined, saying the material was too crude for his image, though he apparently told Brooks privately that he'd be first in line at the theater anyway. That's the strange dual reputation Blazing Saddles carried from day one. Too risky to be part of, but impossible to ignore. Brooks didn't just tolerate chaos on set, he actively built the film around it. The now legendary campfire scene, in which a group of cowboys sit around eating beans and audibly, unapologetically pass gas, marked one of the first times mainstream American cinema had ever let a scene simply be that crude and let it linger. Test audiences reportedly laughed so hard at early screenings that Brooks went back into post-production and added more sound effects, because the joke was working better than anyone had planned for. The reasoning behind it wasn't just shock value. Westerns had spent decades presenting cowboys as stoic, clean, mythic figures. Brooks wanted to remind audiences that these were, in reality, sweaty, exhausted men living rough lives in the dirt. Puncturing the myth with something as blunt and human as flatulence was, in its own strange way, a thesis statement for the entire film. That same instinct shows up in one of the film's strangest and most pointed gags, a flashback in which a young Bart and his family, traveling by wagon, are surrounded by Native American warriors on horseback. It looks, for a moment, like it's about to become a grim, familiar Hollywood cliché. Then the tribal chief, played by Brooks himself, opens his mouth and starts speaking fluent Yiddish. The other riders nod along in agreement. It's absurd on its face, but the joke carries real weight. By giving native characters a language Hollywood had almost never let them have, any real, specific voice at all, Brooks was quietly exposing just how flattened and voiceless the genre had made them for decades. The film's opening theme song plays a similar trick. Brooks hired a respected, classically serious Western vocalist to perform the title song and deliberately never told him the movie was a comedy. The result is a booming, utterly sincere ballad sung over lyrics stuffed with ridiculous cliches, a joke the singer never got to be in on, which somehow makes it funnier. By the time the film reaches its climax, that same anarchic spirit takes over completely. The final act abandons the Old West set entirely, spilling out of the fictional town of Rock Ridge and into the literal Warner Brothers studio lot, a giant, sprawling brawl that crashes through sound stages, a musical number in progress, and finally out onto a real Hollywood street. It's one of the earliest and boldest fourth-wall-breaking endings in mainstream American comedy, years before that kind of self-aware humor became common. And that brawl is exactly where the blooper lives. Because the final chase was staged as genuine, uncontrolled chaos, actors running through multiple sets, cameras chasing them in long, unbroken takes, extras and stunt performers colliding across several sound stages at once, the production simply could not control every variable in frame. Crew members have described the sequence as barely choreographed, closer to a controlled riot than a traditional shot list. Somewhere in the middle of that fourth wall-shattering dash across the studio lot, ordinary studio activity kept happening in the background because nobody had cleared the entire lot for a scene this sprawling. Look closely enough at the wide shots as the cast spills out past the studio gates, and you can catch a detail that has nothing to do with the story at all. A piece of the real, ordinary studio going about its business, caught by accident in a frame meant to look like fictional bedlam. It's the kind of thing that's easy to miss on a first watch, or a 10th, because everything around it is moving so fast and so loud that your eye is trained to look at the joke, not the background. Brooks himself reportedly wasn't bothered when things like this turned up in dailies. His attitude toward accidents on this film was consistent. If it didn't break the illusion in a way that hurt the joke, leave it in. Perfection was never really the goal. Momentum was. That philosophy is exactly why a small slip like this could survive 50 years of scrutiny from film buffs, critics, and frame-by-frame internet sleuths without ever becoming common knowledge. Blazing Saddles is such a dense film, packed with sight gags, background jokes, and rapid-fire dialogue, that a single background inconsistency in its most chaotic sequence simply gets swallowed by everything else happening on screen. It's not a scandal. It's not evidence of some hidden secret. It's just proof of how honestly improvised this ending really was, stitched together from real chaos rather than tightly engineered choreography. For every gag that survived into the theatrical release, there were several that didn't, and the reasons they got cut tell you almost as much about the film as the ones that stayed in. Brooks and his writers reportedly drafted material for the flirtatious scenes between the villain's seductive singer and the new sheriff that pushed considerably further than what audiences eventually saw, leaning hard into stereotypes about race and masculinity before undercutting them with a punchline. In interviews given years later, Brooks admitted some of that material never made it to a final shooting draft, or was shot and then quietly shelved, because even by the standards of a film built on provocation, it risked overwhelming the joke with the shock. What's telling is that Brooks, decades on, has expressed something close to regret about pulling back in a few of those moments. Not because he wanted the film to be crueler, but because he worried in hindsight that he'd occasionally chosen safety over the exact kind of discomfort the film was supposed to traffic in. That tension, between wanting to go further and worrying the joke wouldn't land the way it was intended, runs through a lot of the film's production history. It wasn't a film made by people who agreed on exactly where the line was. It was made by people constantly testing it, then arguing about whether they'd gone too far or not far enough, scene by scene. That same instinct for pushing right up to a boundary and then deciding, in the moment, whether to cross it is part of what made the production so unpredictable to work on. Actors have described a set where scripted lines were treated as a starting point rather than a finish line. Wilder's loose, off-the-cuff delivery as the Waco Kid was reportedly built on small changes he made take to take, rather than sticking rigidly to the page. Little's dry reactions often weren't